And there's this scene in which he sort of opens his eyes to really seeing what the Matrix truly is. And he looks around, and what before was like people and buildings, he just sees binary code. He can like see the code. And then he like sort of takes joy in the strength of his own knowledge of the universe, and he like flexes, and the universe just like sort of, waves out around him. This is like intense moment. And that's what learning Latin and Greek can feel like.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Jason Pedicone. Jason is the founder of the Paideia Institute, a nonprofit that helps young people learn ancient Greek and Latin, and that runs travel programs to Europe where kids can study the classics in the places where the classics were originally written. And in today's episode, Jason and I talk about the value of learning dead languages and why, even though no one speaks ancient Greek and Latin anymore, why it's such a valuable endeavor to help one understand both the world that they live in and also the history of thought that explores the human condition, and why this is perhaps one of the most valuable things that a human can spend time doing. We talk about the relationship between learning about the classics and engaging in the practical world. And we talk about the history of studying classics and how we've been in a long, slow decline of studies in the classics, especially since the 1960s, and how in today's world, only 1% of high school students study Latin, but how there is a long, rich tradition of people studying Latin and ancient Greek and the classics as a prerequisite and as preparation for engaging with the world, and why there is value in that that's being lost. We talk about etymology and about some of the things about language that studying dead languages can help us understand. We talk about why, in a world with a rapidly growing emphasis on AI, why it's more important than ever to study the classics. And we talk about the programs that Jason is building and some of the resources that he's creating, especially for homeschoolers, to support in students' learning of ancient Greek and Latin. I got to ask Jason a ton of questions that I have about etymology and the history of language and how understanding those things can change how we perceive the world. And I hope that you enjoy listening. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm super excited to have you here. So I made the mistake of not hitting record when we first jumped on the call, and we got on this very interesting rabbit hole that absolutely deserves to be a part of the conversation that we're about to have. So I'm going to awkwardly restart the conversation and bring us back into this, because we were talking about the nature of time. I'd asked you how your week is going, and then we both started reflecting on how strange the concept of a week is and these weird parameters that we put on our own time. And you were talking about removing oneself from the artificial constraints of thinking in terms of linear time. And you were talking about the origin of the word minute and the origin of the word second. Can you go back into that explanation again? Because this was fascinating. And I would be very selfish if I did not share this with the audience too, and if I just got to enjoy this explanation.
I will do my best. Right. Yeah. So I'll say that, you said, sometimes we come to the end of the week and we feel like we lose track of time. And I said, or
yeah,
you
like
could
a week
say,
happens, I think.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Or you could say that you were freed, when you get into the zone, you were freed from the constraints of the construct of time. So then I said, and I can think of a classical, as we'll talk about, I'm a classics guy. I can think of a classical etymology because the word minute and second are actually adjectives, and the full term is minuta pars in Latin, a minute part, and second comes from secunda pars, the second part. But it sort of speaks to the broader the broader way in which we've developed these little discrete parts to measure things. And how, in fact, reality is not really like that. Like reality is analog. It's smooth. It doesn't get broken up into these discrete things. And so, sort of a interesting way that etymology sheds light on the true nature of reality.
So do you know where, like, do you know why you said minuta part or minuta? So say it again. I clearly don't see that.
Like minute, right? Like something's
Uh-huh.
minute, it's small. Minuta pars, like a small part. So, like when they're, I don't know a lot about this, but presumably just guessing from the Latin, like when they're dividing the unit of time up, they're like, okay, well, let's go down to the smallest part because that's what we'll use to count in. And actually, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because, like a huge issue of our time, right, is digitality versus analogness, or and sort of deciding for various experiences, like do we want to embrace digitality or do we want to embrace analogy, I guess you could say. And sort of I was talking about it recently with a professor friend of mine, and he was telling me that he had this amazing discussion with poets and physicists trying to understand like the difference between these two concepts, and Latin helps you out there as well, because digital, what does digital mean? Digital comes down to the sort of binary digits that computers are made out of, these ones and zeros, which are also small pieces used to measure things. And digit also means finger, right? Like your digit. So that's like another thing that we count with, this small individual thing, whereas something that's analog is not broken up into those like little discrete parts. It's smooth, it's ongoing. Like our true experience of reality is not, we can't point to little pieces of reality. It's one smooth analog experience. And then, so that sort of you can extract from there and sort of understand a lot of things.
So do you know why, like, this is a complicated question. I'm trying to distill it down very simply. Do you know what the contextual setting was in which this breakdown into minuta pars occurred? Like, do you know why, like what that, because when you dig into the language, you start to understand, oh, this is the rationale for where this came from.
Right.
But do you understand, like, you have more context about how, do you have a better sense of what the logic was? Like, it was kind of arbitrary, I would assume. It's like we have this continuum that we are just defining at time. Somehow we have to figure out, like, okay, people are born and then they die and things happen in between, and like theoretically that can be parsed out. But it became this, like, we think about it in this very rigid way where like we have seconds and minutes and hours and days and weeks, and it's just the way that things are, but it wasn't necessarily always that way. Do you know kind of the evolution of thought around time that led to these distinctions?
So I think, I'm not a scientist, but I think it has to do, ultimately it's all based on sort of like, the world, the planet rotating and going around the sun and the amount of time that those things happen, right? But then also I would presume like, we have like 10 fingers. So we like have we count things in tens, things like, I suspect that that's where it all comes from. I don't know if that's what you're getting at with your question, or if you...
It's a little more, I know my question is really murky. It's a little more, I think I'm more curious about the underlying evolution of thought, which is why I'm having trouble distilling this question down into something very simple, because it is a very abstract and nebulous thing. Like, we got on this rabbit hole in the first place because I was talking about how time feels very relative to me often. Like, I sort of lose the thread of time when I'm really in a flow state, and then I'll bring my head back up above water, and I'll be thinking about scheduling something or things that I have to do, and all of a sudden I'll realize, oh my gosh, like, it's the middle of November or the middle of December, and how did this happen? I don't know. Yeah. And so it's not always like the natural state of being to be hyper aware of where you are in this fixed continuum of time. Right. And I presume that throughout history, it has been more and less common to be anchored to that based on the nature of the reality that we're living in. Like, we live in an epoch where everything is driven by highly linear times. Like, well, I'm hungry, I have to take care of this by 9 p.m. or all of the places to get food are going to be closed.
as opposed to, well, it's dark, so it's hard to hunt right now, but theoretically I could, eventually it will be light again, but it's not the same kind of fixation that we have now. I have to know my finances in order by the end of the month because I have to pay my quarterly taxes. Like there are all of these we're very fixated on time. And so I'm just kind of curious. I feel like the conversation that we originally had kind of alluded to the fact that there's this, that's not necessarily just the default nature of reality. It's sort of the nature of reality that we built.
Totally.
And so I'm just curious about, and I don't know if you have an answer to this either, but it makes me wonder about the evolution of this through time.
Well, it definitely brings two things to mind. One is the famous story of the Native Americans when they met the European settlers, and they were like, man, these guys need to look at their watch to know when they're hungry or something like that. Which that doesn't seem right historically. Maybe it was a Native American remarking on a European in the 19th century, but it's the same idea. Our lives are governed by this contrived system of time that we've created. But another interesting example is that in ancient Rome, hours changed length depending on the time of the year. So it wasn't just like an hour is always 60 minutes long. In the summer, the hours were longer, and in the winter, the hours were shorter. And it was because, the planet was further or closer to the sun. And so, it's just an example. Like for them in the summer, time stretched on and time felt longer. And so that's kind of, I guess, like an example of what you're saying, and sort of, maybe like as we get better at measuring things, we become more enthralled to our own systems. Like we try to invent these very simplified systems to control things, but like they also exert a control on us.
So I'm not trying to take us down too deep of a rabbit hole, although I'd also be very happy if that's what we ended up doing for a while, because that's part of the fun of conversing with interesting people. But there's a deeper thing that I'm fascinated by that I'm kind of getting at with this question, which is the idea of the connection between etymology and learning how to understand the way that we think about the world and the malleability of that over time. I was thinking about, before this interview, what do I really want to ask Jason about? Because there's tons of things that we can talk about. It's like, okay, if I have you for an hour and a half, what are the most important things that I am dying to ask you? And the top of the list was, why should kids learn a dead language? Like I have my own hypotheses about this, but I have also not made this my vocation. So I imagine that you have much deeper and more extensive and well thought out opinions on this than I do. But I think it's the kind of thing that often comes up when people are thinking about the classics and especially learning Latin and ancient Greek. It's like, well, we used to have a heavy emphasis on this in education. It was much more common to learn this. And it's sort of, it feels like maybe an innovation to have moved beyond it. It's like, well, you're not going to speak this thing anyway, so why do you need to know it?
Right.
And I think the conversation that we're having it takes a stab at answering that question of, why learn a dead language? Because it helps you understand the living ones, because it helps you understand where our words come from. And our words are not just arbitrary things that we use to describe something. Someone doesn't just sit down. I remember when I was a kid, I decided I was going to invent a new language for some fantasy book I was reading or something, but I didn't understand etymology yet. So I just made up weird sounds and strung them together and thought I was inventing a whole language. Like I'm Tolkien. I'm just, coming up with a new language for my fantasy world. And I didn't understand the layers of logic that underpin how words work. But really it's quite logical. It's quite complex. And there are layers of meaning that are baked into words that if you don't understand the context, you don't understand. Minute is just a random word. It's a set of sounds that someone used to describe a unit of time. You don't understand that it is the logic behind minuta par, the idea of, this is this came from something. It meant something else that was then applied onto how we talk about time. And so I'd like to hear how, I imagine you get this question a lot, especially if you're running courses around learning ancient languages. And I imagine people ask, like, this sounds cool and all, but what's the purpose? Why is this a good thing for my kid to be learning? Yeah. What is your case for why kids should learn Latin, or adults?
Yeah, sure. So definitely a question I get a lot. I have a couple different, I'm smiling because my daughter, who is 4 3/4, has invented her own language, which she calls beauty. The language is called beauty. And I just think it's so, it made me think of it. And, you know, it also sort of gets into one reason, you know, one would learn anything. And that's like, you know, not because, you know, just because it's beautiful and it has an inherent enjoyability, and, you know, we're all attracted to certain things. And so, you know, baked into your question is like, what is the purpose of education? Are we on an ROI model, or are we on a sort of wonder-driven model, or whatever? But you know, I don't actually think that dichotomy obtains. I think that it is both beautiful and useful, and sort of useful because it's beautiful, and beautiful because it's useful. So why should you learn Greek and Latin? I have a couple. So here's a fun way to think about it. Is it fair to refer to the movie The Matrix? Do you think that like most of the audience has seen that and knows the scenes in The Matrix?
I think so. Yeah.
Even though it's 20 years old, it's like the cultural monument.
Yeah. The super homeschooled people might not get it, but everybody else will.
Okay. Well, I'll explain a little bit. So, you know, in The Matrix, it's basically a Platonic allegory anyway. So it's a very classical movie, but there are these people who actually it's the future. It's a dystopian future. There are these people living, and actually machines have taken over. A technology has won. You know, the general AI was in fact evil, and it didn't destroy us. Instead, it put us in these balls of goo, and it harvests us for the electricity that our brains generate, right? And we have a thing plugged into the back of our head, and you know, we think we're just living our lives, but in fact, it's all a simulation. I don't know if you've ever heard the simulation theory. You know this?
Oh, yeah.
It's actually most likely that we are living in a simulation, given infinite universe and infinite time and infinite space.
Most likely? You need to expand on that.
Well, think about it. You know, if we're given infinite time and infinite space in the universe, then, you know, chances are some civilization, I mean, depending on your worldview, right? But like, chances are some civilization probably did exist long enough to develop such advanced technology that it could put other people in a simulation. So if you actually think about it logically, like it's like actually more likely that we are than we are. But anyway, I digress. So it's that it's that future, and there's this one hero character named Neo who wakes up. And he realizes, you know, he takes the red pill, and he wakes up and he sees, you know, that he's living in this matrix, that reality is not real. And then he goes through, you know, goes on adventures, and eventually sort of like, you know, the hero sort of transcends and develops these sort of like godlike superpowers. And there's this scene in which he sort of opens his eyes to really seeing what the matrix truly is. And he looks around, and what before was like people and buildings, he just sees binary code. He can like see the code. And then he like sort of takes joy in the strength of his own knowledge of the universe. And he like flexes, and the universe just like sort of, you know, waves out around him. You know, this is like intense moment. And that's what learning Latin and Greek can feel like. It's this sort of, you know, vision into the true nature of things. And it's language, but it's also more like civilization, culture. You see, you know, the fabric of reality and how it's put together. You see the fabric of history, culture. And, for me, particularly for Western civilization, Greek and Latin are really like keys to that, like they are the building blocks of everything. This is the language that all of history and cultures were written in. This is what people were expressing philosophical concepts in. I'll give you another example. It's a very sort of moving moment for me. In fact, I trace this as the moment in my life where I decided that I wanted to study these classical languages. I was reading Hamlet, and I was in high school, and I was, generally like a literary guy, like books and, stories and language and whatever. And I remember, I don't even remember like where it is in Hamlet, but I think it's in the all the world is stage speech, and he's talking about Hecuba, and he says, what's Hecuba to him, or he to her, that he should weep for her? And I was like, who is Hecuba? It's like this weird name. And then I was like, oh, I get it. Like these guys all know these ancient stories, and like Shakespeare knew this ancient story. And for me to really like understand Shakespeare, which I thought was like the coolest thing ever, I have to like know who Hecuba is. And that like started, me down this path of just trying to know what all this stuff was. I was like, if I really want to know who Hecuba is, I need to learn Greek so that I can read Homer in the original, And so you sort of see how everything's connected, and how these things that we admire today, if you really want to understand them, you kind of have to keep going back, until you get down to the binary code, as it were, that civilization is built out of.
Can you talk a little bit more? I really want to get into the weeds on this, because I think this is really important. And I think it's an appreciation that we have lost. Like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure you also know the history of this much better than I do. But the way I understand it is that 100 years ago, and at any point in time beyond that, there was a much deeper appreciation for what learning the ancient languages and the classics could unlock. It was much more common. If you went to any type of elite school, you were probably studying Latin. I did a year of Latin when I was in high school, and I decided I loved the classics, and I was like, I really want to dig into this and understand the basics of how Latin works and what it is. And I got all these books out of the library trying to figure out, like what resources I wanted to use. And I ended up, the textbook that I used I found it at a used book sale at a library. And it had been like the textbook that was in schools. I think the publication date on it was like 1911 or something like that. And it had the notes in the margins from different students who had used it over the years. It was really cool. But it was much more common for Latin to be something that you expected to be learning in school, or you expected a student to engage with. Right. And I feel like we've lost some of the appreciation of that. So I think my question is in two parts. One is about, like, am I right about this intuition that this is how we've sort of lost the appreciation with this over time? But then also, like, with the loss of the appreciation, I feel like has also come a loss of the understanding of what this can unlock. Like, I feel like everything that you are describing it's not something that is instinctive for most people to know this can do for you, because it's just sort of, we've lost it on a cultural level.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. It's a complicated situation, like, yes, Latin was way more prevalent in elite educational institutions 100 years ago. That's definitely the case, and that's because a lot fewer people also got educations in general 100 years ago. I mean, people were still largely agricultural, I would say, in much of the world at that time. It's not 100, 150, and people just like weren't doing humanistic educations at all. Why did they learn Latin? Well, if you think about what education was at that time, like, that the people who were getting an education were sort of an elite ruling class, and they were expected to engage with, the greatest things that had ever been thought and said to sort of, prepare them for their leadership roles in society. And up until that point, the greatest things that had ever been thought and said were all thought and said in Latin. and eventually also, French, German, and English and other languages. But these languages were really foundational. Because Latin was the lingua franca of academic scholarship until the 18th century, and even in the 19th century, there were still, important works being written in Latin. So you had to know Latin. This is seen also if you go to an old elite university like Harvard or Princeton, and you look at the classics department, they'll have 10 classics majors a year, and then there'll be 17 endowed chairs for classics professors. So it's not uncommon that there's more professors in the department than students graduate, because 400 years ago when the university was founded, it was such an important focus, and that section of the endowment has been accruing compound interest for 4 centuries or something like that. So they're very well resourced, these departments. So it definitely was a access point for elite society, and you could, if you knew Latin, you could, and you knew the classical past, you could engage with that history. You were let in, basically. You were in that elite guild. There are also some sort of really horrible aspects to that. I think it's John Calhoun famously said, show me a black man who can learn Greek, and I'll agree that the races are equal. I'll agree that they're not inferior to white people. Because this is just an example of the way in which these languages were tied to sort of elite education. Education has changed, I think, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. And now we're at the beginning of the digital revolution, and it's changing even faster. I think we've kind of moved away from a model that's based on character formation, go study the best things that have ever been thought, and then go govern the provinces. That was the old British imperial model for the classical education, which is why, in British society, even today, you meet all these CEOs and stuff who just did classics. They read greats at Oxford, and now they're running the family company or whatever. But we're moving away from that model, and we're moving more towards a model that is based on a return on investment, and focusing on career training instead of character training. And so I think, and also particularly in America, higher education, at least, and in many cases also private, secondary education, extremely expensive. It's a huge financial investment. And so, the whole system is, I think, moving away from that, character formative model, which, maybe it's good as a whole because it's going to lift a lot of people out of poverty, and it's a good system for, delivering skills to people to help them bootstrap themselves up socioeconomically. But I personally want to know the greatest things that have ever been thought and said, I want to participate in that history. And so unfortunately now I think the way education is developing, it's militating against people getting that kind of training. You're not incentivized. And this is why we see classics programs closing, all over the country, Latin programs closing. It's just not, the model that we have set up is not conducive to humanistic study.
Where did that shift really start to occur? Like, what is the timeline for this moving away from the classics? Because like we said, 100 years ago, it was common to learn the classics. It's not now. Where did that shift happen? Was it gradual?
I think it was in the 60s. There was kind of a like little mini, or maybe not so mini, cultural revolution, in the Western world at that time. And, for instance, the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, I forget the exact year, but I'm not Catholic, but the year the Catholic Church dropped Latin as the language that the Mass was in, that happened during the 60s in an attempt to be more accessible, and they're still fighting over it, like yesterday, there's articles coming out about how Pope Francis canceled the Latin Mass here and they're trying to bring it back, So I think probably, this shift towards a more ROI focused model of education happened around then. And that's really when you started to see, like Latin persisted because, even if the shift may have happened sooner, there was still an idea that like learning Greek and Latin made you an educated person. But I think in the 60s that began to be kind of like unmoored. And it was actually like, no, in fact, learning these languages is silly and a waste of time. And we should be learning Spanish and Mandarin and learning to code. I know schools where they like allow coding to count as a language, which is just like, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I speak English and Python.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It's just
C++.
It's a cool. Don't get me wrong. I love coding languages. I think they're really interesting and you can do great stuff with them. But it's a different, talk about the difference between digital and analog. It's a different skill. And, the problem is I think that like often in some ways what's good for society as a whole, arguably, if we are indeed lifting people out of poverty by developing a sort of more, sort of egalitarian and accessible educational model that transfers skills, et cetera, we're losing these opportunities to do this kind of like deep, personal, spiritual growth and character formation. And that's important for people too. So like, if you can't get that at school, you gotta get it elsewhere.
There's something interesting here that I want to drill into for a second. I find the fact that you brought up coding is really fascinating to me because you could sell learning a coding language and learning Latin using in some ways exactly the same terminology. Like, come learn this language to get a window into how the world around you works.
Right.
Because when you learn a coding language, you start to understand, you and I are interacting through this computer screen. I am not a coder. It's just magic that like I plug in everything. Totally. And of course I can see you on the other side. Like I have this window to like halfway across the country and we're like, waving at each other through it and having this interesting conversation about ancient Rome. But when you start to understand the coding language, you start to understand the logic behind this. Like I have a friend who's a developer and I remember we had lunch once and we were talking about, I was asking him about how to think through the eyes of a developer, because I was really curious. I'd heard him talk about engineering projects he was working on. And I was fascinated by the way he talked about the logic structures that are built into designing a piece of software. Like there were some features that could just be added later, no problem. But there are some things that you have to proactively predict many iterations before the thing actually would be launched. Like you're building this MVP version of your whatever tool you're developing, right. But you have to understand like in 2 years when we're like heavily funded and we're building, we've got a whole team of engineers and we're building out this complicated thing. We have to know now in the MVP what types of features we want to have because the entire logic of the model rests on what types of features we want to have. We'll build it in different ways, depending on if we want it to do X or if we want it to do Z.
Some things are just foundational,
Yeah. And I was fascinated by that. I was like, I'm not a coder. I don't know. Like, you can't just go to your keyboard and like hit some things and make this whole new feature. Like, I didn't know that there were logic structures. And so I became fascinated and I started asking him about it. And he was explaining that like some things are very easy to build, and other things he was telling me that his most frequently asked for app from, like just like friends and family members at gatherings, people will ask, could you make an app where I take a picture of my food and it tells me how many calories are in it? Like that would be super cool. Yeah. And he's like, there is no logic structure that allows that to occur. He's like, no, I can't do that. But people don't understand why, because they don't understand coding. So if you start to understand a programming language, you start to understand the framework structures upon which all of these technical tools that we rely on a daily basis function, and what is and isn't possible. And it allows you to start to think contextually and creatively about it, which is very similar to what you're describing with Latin and language and ideas and thought, except one of them is, they're two wildly different things. One of them is very grounded in the present. One of them is much more perhaps timeless in understanding human thought. But I'd be curious to hear you talk about the distinction between those things. Because if both of them can be fun, interesting things, you're not going to be a programmer, you're not going to be a Latin scholar professionally. But like if you were going to learn one or the other, theoretically, they both help you understand how the world works. And yet there's a great distinction between these two things.
Yes. Okay. So there's a lot there. The story of, just to go back to this idea of like foundationalism, I want to tell the anecdote that when I was a graduate student, I did a brisk business in tutoring eminent Ivy League philosophers and historians in ancient Greek. These were people who had tenure, multiple books out at Ivy League schools, and were like beating themselves up about the fact that they didn't know ancient Greek or didn't know Latin, because those things are so foundational to history and philosophy. And they felt like a babe in the woods trying to really understand Plato or, the history of like Judaism in 16th century Spain, for instance, which, or 15th century Spain, which one of my tutees, my students, worked on. Because they didn't have that foundation, and they couldn't go back and get it. It was like they were in their 50s or 60s now. They were established. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the sort of mental flexibility, brain flexibility to do it. So I totally think that's true. And sort of investing in this stuff early really does pay dividends later in life. Now, to compare like learning an ancient language to coding, it's a very interesting comparison. So I guess like my immediate, so like why would you do one versus the other? I mean, like the immediate and most obvious answer is like, the way tech is going right now, like nobody's going to be coding except for very few people in like the very near future. Like you can log into an AI chatbot right now and ask it to write JavaScript that like pretty much works, and we're just at the beginning of that, the digital revolution. Like we're about to live through a revolution that's going to make the industrial revolution look like nothing, probably, in terms of like the changes that it wreaks on society, and so, to me, it's like, well, I'm going to get like really good at like working on, gasoline powered car engines. It's like, all right, well, like 10 years from now, there's not going to be any more gasoline powered cars on the road because we're transitioning to electric. So like, I think probably coding, at least just from a purely practical perspective, is probably not a, it's interesting to learn how it works, and if you have an immediate like business application or something, maybe you want to dive in and learn the basics, but long term, it's going to be done mostly by machines, and a very small number of people are going to be writing the code that powers those coders. And you might be one of them, but it's not going to be like I'm not so sure how everyday valuable it's going to be. On the other hand, as a result of the future that's coming, which is going to be highly, highly automated, everybody's going to have a lot of time on their hands. And, they're going to have more time to, think about the human condition, and not just like, as not just recreationally, like what it means to be human is actually like pretty important right now, because we're like moving into an era where artificial intelligence is getting more and more powerful. And, like building the electric car is becoming less the problem. And it's more like deciding if the electric car has to like hit someone, like, does it hit like two people in their 80s or one person in their 40s? These are these like
trolley problems.
Yeah, these are these human problems that machines can't solve, that are, the bread and butter of philosophy and literature and history. And so I think there's like actually like a decent practical argument for like diving into the humanities right now.
So basically you're saying AI is coming, go study the classics.
I actually just wrote an article called
That's what I'm referencing.
Yeah. AI is coming for your job. Go study the classics. Yeah. I do think that there's there's going to be more, and to go back to the beauty side of things, like, I think that it's likely that a lot of people's jobs will be replaced by AI. And when that happens, like, hopefully it will also come with, this is hard for people to think about right now, and it's a little bit, dystopian or whatever, but like, presumably that will also come with superabundance of resources, and maybe there'll be UBI, or who knows, maybe we'll all go back to, subsistence farming. Is everybody ready to sort of cope with sitting around all day? I would be excited. I have plenty of stuff I want to read, because I've been studying the classics my whole career, and all I know is like the extent of my ignorance, But I think, training the mind, training the character, delving back in, to history and, and literature and poetry is also like a great way to spend time. It's wholesome. It's, you feel good about yourself. You learn, you understand better who you are, what it means to be a human being, So I think there's just like a lot of arguments for the humanities right now, and the arguments have been getting stronger. Whereas the whole like, oh, it'll give you like critical thinking skills that we used to say in the 90s when the guys over in the other room were like, building the internet. It was like maybe slightly like a less compelling argument. But now I just think the tools are getting so powerful that we should all prepare to have a lot more leisure time on our hands.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I am not currently in the market for a house, but when I am, I will absolutely be working with the John Galt Mortgage Company, which was founded by my friends Mitch and Tim earlier this year. Mitch and Tim have been working in the real estate world for years, and they learned that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't even know how much extra profit is baked into the cost. So Mitch and Tim decided to build a new kind of mortgage, one where they voluntarily cap their own profit on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. When I am on the market for a house, I will absolutely be working with Mitch and Tim. And if you are in the market, you should absolutely check out what they're doing and get a quote for interest rates that they can offer you. You can connect with them at johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find the link down in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. This is really interesting because I've had a few different conversations, both on and off the show, about the implications of AI on how to think about not just your own, like what we're in for as adults with careers and vocations with AI developing so rapidly, but you're forced to think on a longer time horizon when you're thinking about educating a child. And there's a level of prediction that one endeavors to embody in thinking about I'm preparing my child for a world, a certain type of world. And throughout history, it's been relatively easy to predict sort of the general landscape of that world, even if there are grand variables like wars and famines and plagues and all sorts of things that you can't predict. The general sort of structure of inputs and outputs, and in order to get X, you must do Y, relatively predictable. Like, you understood the rules of the game that your kid was going to be playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine that through many great changes throughout history, that it's always felt tenuous. It's like, the machines are coming for our jobs in the industrial revolution.
Right. They were saying this about the cotton gin, like.
Yes. Yeah. There's an important level of historical context here where, every change up to this one was the big one.
Right.
And we're still here. And now the big one is coming. And it's like, well, I don't know. We haven't seen a world with AI before. Maybe it is the big one. Maybe it's just the next iteration in this very long story of us automating ourselves out of having to do things that we maybe hold on to as a core part of our identity, but maybe aren't actually fundamental to our experience of being human at all. Like, I don't think most people sit around pining for having to saw boards by hand and, carefully hew out all the things, all the pieces of a log that you need to build a shed to keep your...
Right. We do that for fun now.
Yeah, but it's not, but you choose to do it because it's fun. Right. I don't think anybody's sitting around going, actually, that's not true. There are some weird rabbit holes there's some weird pockets of Twitter where people absolutely do talk about this. But generally speaking, I don't think the average person is like, my life would be so much better if I was belaboring this tree that I felled last week to, turn it into some new board so I could patch the holes in my roof so that my fireplace heat doesn't all escape out into the ether and we all freeze to death this winter. Right. And I imagine that, we probably won't feel that way about the things like programming, like you mentioned, with enough time elapsing. Like, as individuals, we hold on to these things as our identity, but this is part of human history. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too in a second, because I think there's a lot. I don't know. I could be very wrong in my take about AI, but I've had conversations with different people about the implications of AI as they pertain to education specifically. I had Michael Ellsberg on the show a month or two ago, and he started his career he wrote a book called The Education of Millionaires and another one called The Last Safe Investment, where he talked about, people who are successful, what are the things in themselves that they are investing in, what are the skills that they're building that sort of transcend all other skills, the sort of umbrella skills that allow you to do all the different things that you might want to do over the course of your career.
Right.
And he pivoted to talking about AI quite a bit because as a writer, he feels like it's really changing the trajectory of his career and it's making him rethink a lot of things. But I find it very interesting that what you're describing, it feels almost, you're talking about studying the classics as this very existential thing. Like, we're going to have a lot of time on our hands. We're going to simultaneously revert back to the things that make us very human, but also we have to, in order to have some sense of purpose and meaning in a world where many of the structures that we've attached meaning to no longer exist or are necessary. Like, someone who's hewing logs for fun is aware that they're doing it for fun. They're aware that this is not a battle that they must win in order to survive another winter. If they mess up, they can just go to Home Depot. Like, it's not the same as this actually being a struggle for life or death like it once was.
Right.
And I think I just find it very interesting that a lot of these things, you talked about the sort of utilitarian approach to education versus what you called it, character versus.
Character formation versus sort of a practical return on investment model.
Yeah, you had a nice alliteration you used earlier that's escaping me, but you framed it very nicely. But it's it's interesting to think about the classics in those terms. And I want to delve into this a little bit more, because I don't know that it's necessarily intuitive. I don't think most people go, wow, like AI is coming, I better read some Homer immediately.
Yeah. Maybe not. Well, let's go. Let's work with a classical paradigm, okay? Because that's my shtick. So the liberal arts. Why are they called the liberal arts? Let's start there. Gives us another nice etymology to explore. So,
because liberals study them? I don't know. I'm kidding.
Yeah, right. Because, only people who vote for Democrats.
As opposed to the conservative arts, I'm not sure. What does it mean?
Well, I've noticed a lot of conservative commentators like bashing art history degrees lately. There might be some truth to that, but that's not what I was going to say. So the definition of the liberal arts is in contrast to the servile arts. So in ancient Roman education, you had the liberal arts, which were for free people, and the servile arts, which were for non-free people. So servus in Latin means slaves, right? And so what were the liberal arts and the servile arts? So the servile arts were anything related to money making. I don't know, banking, or, in ancient Rome, finance, or managing the house, or, the various trades. These are all classified in the Roman mind as the servile arts. And then the liberal arts were for the people who were free from those obligations. And the liberal arts were focused on figuring out how to lead the good life. Philosophy, literature, poetry, etc. Right. So it's not the first time it's occurred to people that, like, man, if I didn't have to work so much, I could spend more time thinking about what it means to be a human being, and getting serious about getting to the root of some of these big questions. By the way, also another great thing is the word for children in Latin is liberi, the free ones.
That is my new favorite fun fact in the entire world.
Yeah. and so in a way, the freedom to sort of live in a way where they're pursuing beauty, pursuing wonder, and pursuing the good life is being like a child. Which, by the way, is also the root of the Greek word for education, which is Paideia, which is the name of my company. In Greek, the word Paideia refers to this act of like childlike wonder, in what we're learning. So those are the sort of themes in my mind as I think about this issue. Certainly, yeah, like AI is going to be a game changer, but it's certainly still a matter of degree and not one of kind. We've been moving gradually away from, worrying about, digging out the tree so that we have a canoe to catch fish so that we don't die of starvation for a long time. Now we spend our lives sitting in comfortably climate controlled rooms, looking at screens, many of us doing knowledge work for money. But we have more time on our hands than our predecessors did. And so I think, I don't know that there's anything that groundbreaking or new about what I'm saying. I think it's a very old idea that, the more economic freedom you have, the more you have time for this kind of stuff.
So I feel like there is an existential component to this, though, where, and maybe I'm over dramatizing this, and tell me if you think that I am. And this is less my own, maybe I'm very naive. I'm not that scared of AI. Like, I think it's going to change things, but I don't feel personally like it's an existential threat, but I also think in very agile terms about my work and the structure of my life. Like, okay, new adventure, AI is coming, cool. We'll see where this goes. But I know a lot of people who feel very existentially about it. And I think part of that existentialism is it's almost nihilistic. It's like if the AI comes and it takes away my utility as a person.
Yeah.
Even if I end up if there's some sort of, I've seen, there's so many interesting philosophical conversations that have stemmed from this rapid bloom of AI technology. I've seen interesting arguments for, well, maybe we all should get, like, it's trained on all of our work, so maybe we should all get a slice of the profits from it. And there's some sort of UBI that stems out of AI because the language model was trained on just like everything we all collectively put on the internet, and it's going to take us all out of a job. And so we're entitled to it. Like, there's all these different hypothetical scenarios about how things might unfold where we're all unemployed and we're all living off of AI proceeds or something. We don't, I think people feel very existentially about if my sense of purpose is taken away because the world doesn't need me anymore, because the AI has taken my job. And what is the point of digging a canoe out of a log if I don't need to, like, that's not going to bring me a sense of fulfillment. Then what even is my purpose as a human? And it gets very nihilistic very quickly. And I think I'm curious to hear, because my sense, and I could be wrong about this, is that what you're getting at with studying the classics maybe pertains to that too. Like it sounds like you're talking about studying the classics as if it in and of itself is a source of meaning. It is a purpose. This, grappling with the great questions of what it means to be a human. It feels like that in and of itself is the point in the way that you think about it. So I would love to hear your counter to the people who feel like, well, if AI comes and takes my job, then what is my purpose even to, why am I here? What use am I, and of what use is existing?
Yeah. Well, I would tell those people, I'm sorry that you have been put through a system that brainwashed you to think that your purpose was, to make the widget that you were making every day. But that's not your purpose. And, that was actually just helping this other guy make money at the top of, the guy in the top office upstairs. Lots of different people have interesting theories about what your purpose is. And why don't you go try to figure it out, I forget the exact quote from Aristotle, but he says, philosophy is born in wonder, that's sort of, that question for some people can be nihilistic, and, oh, well, my job is gone. Okay, fine. I'm getting UBI and some nice, some nice lab grown meat and all this hunky dory on the, the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are taken care of, but I'm still going to go, walk into traffic because I don't get to make my widgets anymore. That's a pretty sad conclusion, where the alternative could be, well, what's my purpose anymore? And it's like, well, why don't you go try to find out? Pick up a book, go learn a language, go study history, study philosophy, figure out your spirituality, that's, to me, fundamentally what the humanities are. And unfortunately, I think we live in a world where a lot of people are trained from very young to think that their purpose is to make the widget for the guy on the top floor. And the education system is clearly designed to inculcate that value system. And, even in many Ivy League humanities departments, a weird sort of analogous, rat race has developed, or it's about my purpose on life is to publish the article or get the book out, or it's just another rat race. So that's kind of how I think about it. And so I, for one, welcome our robot overlords because
you're just saying that on digital recording so they know that you're a friend when they come for us.
Because I really think that, this opportunity for leisure could really be really good for people. And, maybe if we have a little bit more time to think about these questions carefully, we can all relax a little bit, because like there's still a lot of misery and conflict in the world. And I don't know how much humanities all of those belligerents have read, but I feel like not enough.
So if even many of the people studying humanities get caught up in the rat race of production and the prestige that comes along with that as a core part of the identity of being successful within the humanities, how would you actually define what the right way is to engage with the classics? Or maybe engage with the classics isn't even quite the right framing, but to engage with the sort of fundamental questions about the human condition. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the ideal way to think about it?
Good question. I would argue a sort of spiritual framework is the way to do it. The universities in this country and worldwide all used to be religious institutions, training monks, and religion has no issues with saying that this is what we should spend our time doing. Thinking about the human condition, being grateful for our existence, et cetera. Secularism has separated our universities from any religious, in most cases, from any religious, doctrine. And that's had some good things about it because it's allowed specialization and I think in some ways more progress. But in some ways, I feel like the humanities in mainstream universities are kind of lost because it's almost become taboo to suggest this kind of, personal, spiritual, engagement with humanistic content and its relevance to our life. It says like formalism, which was like the theoretical framework that was hot while I was doing my PhD, is all about let's look at the text as itself, like a thing over there. I don't even want to know what was going on historically at the time. Super, detached way to think about culture. And that just it's always seemed like a terrible idea to me. What's the point of doing this if we can't speak openly about what it means for our own lives? And I'm not saying necessarily it has to be a Christian, framework. It can be Buddhist or it can be Jewish or Muslim or whatever you want. But I think that, originally that's where the humanities came from. And I think that the more we reconnect them to that mindset, the more useful they'll be for us.
I want to take the conversation away from the AI thing for a moment. And I say this with the acknowledged caveat that the AI thing is real and it is a part of the process of thinking through what the world that our children are going to be living in looks like. It is going to be a significant factor in the dynamics of the world that our children graduate from high school and enter into. That being said, if we take that out of the equation for the moment, assume that we are living in a world where you do have to be productive in some capacity. And not everybody can start an institute and spend their whole life just studying these things. Some people can, maybe more people than we think can, but theoretically not everybody's going to do that. Most people probably wouldn't want to anyway. They want to get into there's some other arena of life that they find compelling and exciting, and they want to test themselves within and see if they can win on that given stage or battlefield. So there is some level of practical knowledge that's also necessary in order to be able to do that. You mentioned earlier the people who study the classics and then go on to run a business. Mm-hmm. There are other things that you need to know besides just Plato and Aristotle to be able to run a company. How do you think about the relationship between learning practically how to engage with the world and studying this much more in-depth, intellectual, sort of character building knowledge? What is the split or the relationship between the two? Because it's not even necessarily like a binary split where it's like you're either learning practical stuff or you're learning the classics and you're never doing both at the same time. Like they can be very intimately intertwined. But I know that some balance exists. And I've noticed, I find it very fascinating. The more people I've met who are very successful business people or who are entrenched somehow, especially in the startup world, most of them are very well read and intimately familiar with the classics, which you would not expect. You think about the tech bro as someone who's very divorced from the tradition. They're very modern. They, are testing out their Soylent diet, and they've got their Whoop watch tracking their sleep, and they've got their Oura ring because they're like A/B testing the two to see which one's working better. And they're wearing barefoot shoes and walking everywhere this month because they've decided that even their electric car is like not forward thinking enough, or, whatever. They're like hyper modern, hyper focused on future. And yet a lot of them do have this great grounding in the past that you wouldn't necessarily think when you just look at how they're presenting at face value. So clearly there is I'm coming at this question from a couple of different angles, but like clearly there's some relationship between practical and classic that is important, even if the arena of life that you want to test yourself within is less intellectual and is more like grounded in practical physical reality. How do you think about the relationship or the tensive pulls between these two things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the sort of, traditional answer is like, oh, well, the humanities teach like critical thinking skills and sort of things like that. Like somehow reading these texts makes us, or studying history, confers skills that allow us to handle modern problems. I think there's probably some truth to that. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that like it's the most efficient way to train yourself to be like a great business person, I would say, correlation does not necessarily always equal causation. It might be that people who succeed in that way are probably smart, and smart people are naturally curious about the world. And, also like the goal of success in business is to get rich, I guess. Right. And so like, what do you do when you're rich? Like you spend your time in investigating these questions. So I don't like to spend a lot of time, banging that drum of like, no, study, be a classics major because it's gonna make you like a really great tech founder. There are some interesting statistics, like the major that is admitted with the highest degree of success to medical and law school, higher than biology or pre-law or poli-sci, is classics. Classics majors have the highest, they're the most successful by percentage at getting into graduate programs in those fields. And, I think it's just because it's a challenging, deep discipline that attracts intelligent people. Like, why would an intelligent person not want to know about the fundamental building blocks of civilization? It just seems more likely that they would. So I think that's why you're going to see successful people who are grounded in the humanities, because it's foolish not to be grounded in the humanities if you're a human being. And I think smart people see that, especially smart people who, have time and resources.
I want to bring this back to where we started this conversation in the first place for a moment, because I'm still very curious about this, which means that I did not ask enough questions.
Okay.
What I want to go back for a moment to this idea that the ancient languages and the classics in general, and maybe it's even worth kind of defining the distinction of the value of both of those things. Like they're not synonymous. They are two separate lines of inquiry that answer, I would presume, correct me if I'm wrong, a separate set of questions, or maybe it's like a Venn diagram of questions, but there's overlap, but there's also separation in the types of things that you can seek via both. But understanding, especially the language part, because I think that's the less intuitive side of this. I think it's easier for people to see the utility of reading a classical work than it is to understand the utility of reading it in its original Latin.
Right.
But this idea that it opens up your capacity to see the code that's running everywhere. This etymology side of things is so interesting to me.
Right.
That you can, when you start to understand the origins of words, you start to understand that there are layered meanings.
Right.
So to your point at the beginning of the conversation about the units of time, we understand that a minute we understand what it is practically. It's 1/60th of an hour. It is the culmination of 60 seconds. It is something that is very quickly passing while I ask you this long-winded question.
It's something that I'm not even noticing because what you're saying is so interesting.
Hopefully the audience feels the same way. If not, I'm very sorry. But this, like, we understand it in terms of time, but then when you start to break down the etymology and you start to understand that it was thought about as a small unit, the smallest unit. It was thought about, like, there were layers of meanings of other words baked into how we think about this, or children being the liberated. Like that's so beautiful. And it's so evocative of the nature of reality of what it is to be a child. But we don't generally think of children, like the first thing that comes to our mind is not this state of being liberated, of being free. We think of them as children. It's like we think about it often in very technical terms. Like every word is a mimetic package that has all of these other associations that come along with it, but we're missing the historical context of the mimetic package.
Right.
Like we think about all the things that come along. It's like, okay, kids, word association, school, I don't know, like toys, playing outside, Nickelodeon, like, I don't know, like whatever things you associate with kids. But what about the word associations of the origins of the words themselves that carry all of this meaning? And you start to see, like, the ancients were trying to define the nature of a child, and they came up with the free ones.
Right.
Because it describes, like, without all of the baggage of all of the things that we've accumulated throughout history of, you know, what is associated with the concept of child, like in its pure state, that was the essence of it. And it helps you understand, it's like, oh, there actually is a lot in our language that is structured in such a way that even implies some of this nature of a child, but we don't see it anymore because we've like lost, it's like we've only read the second half of the book.
Right.
So we think we understand the plot.
Right.
But there's this whole backstory that set all the characters up to be primed to do all of the things in the part of the story that we get to read that we've forgotten. But it makes the characters make sense. It's like when you meet somebody in real life and they behave in a way that's very strange or unpredictable, or they do something hurtful, and you're like, okay, well, in this narrative arc that I understand, I now know that such and such, you know, so-and-so behaves in this way and can't be trusted anymore.
Right.
But you've missed the entire backstory of how they were betrayed time and again as a child, or they had this other hurtful experience that caused them to, you know, you felt like they were betraying you, but they were acting out of self-preservation because they thought that there was this thing that was an existential threat to them, and you've missed this entire backstory. And so you don't understand why they act the way that they do. You just know that they do. And you're like, okay, well, I don't trust so-and-so anymore because they hurt me once. But you don't understand why it is in their nature to behave that way. So there's all of this missing context that we don't have when we don't understand the etymology. But I'm so curious how delving into this has altered and shifted the way that you perceive the world? Like what you see when you look at the code that those of us that have not deeply studied Latin are perhaps missing? Maybe there are some examples that you can give us, or some context that you can share. Like I feel like you're seeing ranges of color that the rest of us are missing, and I really want you to describe what they look like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it happens just like all the time. 80% of English comes from Latin or Greek, so like whenever you encounter a new word, you can put it together. I mean, what a really good example is, like when you go to the doctor, all this medical terminology, like, if you know Greek and Latin, you can understand all that stuff, and just simply like seeing, like putting aside the sort of like, ridiculously sort of scary soundingness of it all, just seeing how it all works, and then like realizing like, doctors and scientists like invented this special language that like most people can't understand, to talk about stuff in ways that are totally overwhelming and inapproachable. Makes you think like, man, this is kind of like, we kind of have like a priestly class in our society of people who know stuff that like, you sort of, so I mean, like it makes you, I mean, I always think it's so weird when doctors, when you're like talking and doctor's like, oh yeah, I see you've got some blepharitis there. And you're sitting there going, I don't know what are you saying? Like, am I dying or not? But if like blepharitis, Greek and Latin, blepharitis just means like, an inflamed eyelid, it means nothing. So that's one example of a sort of area in which, you sort of see the cracks in a way, and it's not as magical and scary as it seems. Another amazing etymology, the word glamour, like when something is glamorous, is related to the word grammar. Because in the Middle Ages, people who knew how language worked seemed like wizards. So they were glamorous because they were grammarous. So there's a way in which it just sort of like deconstructs some of these things. It pulls back the curtain a little bit. But then there's other things that I think are sort of deeper and bigger, where when you can see how like one, like it's like a butterfly flaps its wing in Central Park and then like this stuff all changes. So like my favorite example of this is the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word, etc. In Greek, it's and it was written in Greek, right? Because the New Testament was written in Greek. So if you're Christian, like, you shouldn't need any more convincing to learn Greek. It's just like super important. It says en he arche ein hologos, kai hologos ein pros to theon, okay, etc. It goes on. So the word for word does not really necessarily mean word. Okay. Logos is a super, basic in the sense of like fundamental and wide-ranging Greek concept that could mean word, but could also mean kind of like organizing principle or like laws of physics, So like, and it's Jerome, the translator of the New Testament into Latin, who says in principio erat verbum. He translates it into Latin he translates logos with word. But I mean, think about the difference between the sentence "in the beginning was the word" and in the beginning was the organizing principle. I mean, for a religious worldview, so there's stuff like that too, that you start to see like, man, like all of this stuff is hanging on this one decision right here. And I see what he did there. And it makes me reconsider my entire, conception of all this stuff.
That's fascinating. So we could keep going down this rabbit hole all day, but I feel like we do need to, like, we've established why this is important. I think we've established a fairly compelling argument. And by we, I mean, you've established a very compelling argument, and I have very willingly been led down the path because I'm an easy sell because I love this stuff. But, you know, we've established the value of this. I want to talk about how, like how the practice of how you're delivering this. I want to talk about the work that you do. And if we've answered the question, why should your kid learn Latin? How should your kid learn Latin, which is what you do professionally? Can you talk a little bit about your institute and the work that you do?
Yes, thank you. I would love to, of course. I thought you'd never ask. No.
I'm sorry. I got really distracted by the etymology.
It's all good. Yeah. So I am
It was glamorous.
Yeah. I was so glamorous that we went down many rabbit holes. But I also thought it was fascinating. I really appreciate the questions. But yeah. So what do I do? So I'm the president and co-founder of a nonprofit organization called the Paideia Institute, which promotes the study of the classics, classical humanities in general, but with a strong focus on Latin and ancient Greek. Sort of see learning those languages as kind of like the access point to everything else, learning the history and the literature, et cetera. The story of how I got into this line of work is kind of amazing. So I'll tell it briefly. When I was in my studies, in my undergraduate studies, I heard this story, which almost seemed like it could be a myth or a legend, that there was a monk in Rome who taught people how to speak Latin. And I was taught Latin very traditionally, and it was not spoken, aside from reciting paradigms in a sort of very martinet-like fashion. Which was pretty boring and off-putting. And so the idea of going to Rome and studying Latin with a monk was, especially I grew up in a totally culturally devoid suburb, I'd never really heard Latin anywhere outside of school. So going to Rome to study with a monk was like, somewhere, in the sort of metaphysical realm of hobbits and dragons and things like that. So that monk was actually amazingly an American. He was an American Carmelite friar, technically, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whose name was Reginald Foster. And he loved Latin and entered the priesthood, but excelled so much as Latin that he worked his way up to become the Pope's Latinist. So Latin is still the official language of the Catholic Church, even though it's no longer the language of the liturgy. And they translate everything into Latin. And Reginaldus, this guy, he went by Reginaldus in Latin, and a group of other secretaries were responsible for doing all those translations. But he also was very distressed about what he saw as the death of learning of Latin and classics that he would find. He would meet American Latin teachers who couldn't translate their way out of the paper bag. And he's just like, my God, what's happening? So he started a summer program, which was totally free, and it was taught by him to sort of fight back against the dying of the light, in classics. And it was this amazing experience where he would, take us around Rome to visit ancient sites, like go to the Forum and the Colosseum. And then we would read texts in the places that they described. So you'd be like in the Colosseum reading Augustine, talking about his mixed feelings about gladiatorial combat in Latin, or like on top of Mount Vesuvius, reading Pliny the Younger's description of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Latin. Just sort of like amazing stuff. And he was also an amazing guy, very inspiring, an incredibly caring teacher, and really, lived the kind of like humanism that I was talking about before. I mean, his relationship to this stuff was clearly about understanding the world, understanding the human condition, and improving ourselves and our character. And so he made me want to be a classics professor. And so I went off to graduate school, did a Ph.D. in classics at Princeton. But as I sort of alluded to before, I was somewhat, unimpressed with like the sort of academic rat race that I encountered in elite Ivy League academia. It seemed more about, how many articles could you publish and how many books could you publish, and not really, holistic in the way that I wanted. And so when Reginaldus got sick and had to stop teaching in Rome, we founded our organization originally to continue his legacy. And so for the first sort of several years, we were running programs similar to his, teaching the languages originally in Rome. Eventually, we expanded also to Greece and elsewhere in Europe, and bringing students on these experiences. That was great, and we still do that, and we've expanded since that time. But it's not hard to see that. Although he fought very hard against it, the direction access to classics education is going in this country is not good. The modern, all humanities are in trouble, but classics in particular has just been nosediving, for the past 20 years. The MLA, the Modern Languages Association, just released this data, and it shows like a 20% decline in the number of students studying Latin in the past 5 years. So truly vertiginous falls. And so, partially for existential reasons for ourselves, and partially because, it's our mission. We're a nonprofit organization. We felt a need to try to figure out creative ways to solve this problem. And the problem is somewhat partially pedagogical. Like, the pedagogy is not always great. That's some people will know that scene from Monty Python, where the guy is like writing graffiti on the walls, and then the Roman centurion comes over and grabs him by the ear and like corrects his grammar. How many Romans? And he wrote, so that derives from the traditional Latin teacher. That's the archetypal Latin teacher, very mean, sort of obsessed with grammar. We've at Paideia, we've tried to develop a pedagogy that's like more fun and engaging and, connected to the way Reggie used to teach, that sort of makes, all the value that we've been discussing here resonate. But a lot of it is just about access, because it was like only the elite schools taught it anyway, and now even they're canceling programs. So it's like, 1% of American high school students study Latin, and something like probably 0.0001% study ancient Greek in high school. It's like, it's vanishingly small for Greek. So, we want to change that. And our mission now, we continue to offer our travel programs in Italy and Greece, but our mission now is developing stuff so that anyone, anywhere can get a quality, affordable education in Greek and Latin. And so we've been offering synchronous online courses for a couple of years now. That's like, courses in Latin, Greek, but also reading courses in translation in the classics, history, mythology, where it's like, 4 or 5 students in a class with a teacher. You meet up on Zoom and you work through a text. So we offer those. But now the big thing we're working on now are software products which do asynchronous, self-paced online learning. So we've got a curriculum for Latin out now. It's called Elementa, which is for younger kids, like 4th through 6th grade. It's a great tool that can be used by, parents to teach your kids. You don't have to know Latin well yourself to use it. It's $10 a month to sign up, and it comes with all sorts of great materials. And then we've got out in beta now also a Latin course for high school students, high school and up. It could be used for college students and adults as well, which is going to be launching. Actually, the full production version will be out this month. And that, if you do that course, that will give you a high quality, proper Latin education that will prepare you to read the ancient texts in the original. So that's sort of like the lay of the land, and that's what we're trying to do to solve the problem.
What types of students are you hoping to serve? Is the stretch goal for every student to be accessing this information? Like every student in the country should learn Latin? Is it like certain types of students tend to be a really good fit for the program? Talk a little bit more about like what types of people you want to be working with.
Right. So if I'm a parent listening to this, students who are like into reading, into history, into stories, like language, those are the kids who are traditionally attracted to Latin. But if I'm allowed to proscribe who has to learn it, and prescribe it as an antidote for many problems facing society, I would say, everybody should have some. We also run, I didn't mention this yet, but we run a literacy program. It's a after school literacy program. It's a free version. So our curriculum for kids learning Latin is called Elementa. But we have a free version, which volunteers teach for free in after school programs to kids who are at risk for not reading at grade level. So we go often in big cities and kind of poorer areas. We're going into elementary schools and teaching the kids Latin after school because it improves their reading ability and it improves their linguistic awareness. Many of them are Spanish speakers. It makes them realize, hey, English and Spanish come from the same language. There's a connection here, So I think, we'd all be better off if everybody learned a little Greek and Latin.
I assumed that was your answer based on everything you said thus far. So if you're doing in-person stuff with the literacy program, first of all, what age levels are you working with? And second of all, like where are you located that you're doing that?
Yeah. So our curricula are for 4th through 6th and then sort of 7th and up. And there's some play between, some people use the Elementa curriculum also in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And some people use the upper level curriculum, which is called Living Latin in 7th grade. For our outreach work, 4th graders, 3rd graders, it's helpful if they can read a little bit. That's, once they're able to make out words and understand how letters work, you can start introducing Latin. There's no reason. I teach my daughter all sorts of Latin words for stuff. She loves it. We wanted to build our courses in a way that, allows parents who are interested but might not know Latin themselves, but maybe they always wanted to, or they wish that they had started with Latin when they were young, to like give it to their kids. So a parent could buy the upper level course and teach themselves some Latin, and also use like the teacher's manual to teach Latin to their kids using the lower course. So it's pretty flexible, and it's designed in that way. And then we're also, we're targeting a lot of schools, wish they could do it, but can't find teachers because the general sort of, moribundness of the discipline is meaning that there's a shortage of teachers and sort of everything's collapsing. So frequently we have schools write in and be like, we really believe in the value of the classical education. We really want our kids to learn Latin, but we can't find a Latin teacher. Can we use your curriculum? And then we send them, online seats, and we train their Spanish teacher to guide the kids through. So that's the setup.
I think that something you just said is incredibly important, which is if a parent wishes that they had learned Latin and they never got the chance, they can learn it while simultaneously supporting their child through it. There are two things about this that I absolutely love. The first is that supporting in the education of your child gives you a second chance to also learn all of these things, to make time for in a practical sense, things that you maybe never got a chance to do, which I think is so cool and is infinitely underrated and not talked about enough in conversations about education. The second thing is this idea that you can be simultaneously learning it while supporting your kid through it, and you can be, you can find resources that support you through that exact process.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people get very tripped up by the fear that, well, I never learned this, so how on earth could I help my kid learn it?
Yeah.
And I love that that's baked directly into how you think about this. It's like 1% of high schoolers learn Latin. The chances are very high that you never did, but that doesn't have to stop you from being the primary facilitator with the correct resources to help your kid learn this. I think that's so important.
Totally. Yeah. And because of the way our courses are designed, we also have lots of individual learners. So we have a lot, like I actually just had lunch with a guy from Tucson, Arizona. I'm in New York City, who found our course online in his retirement. He's a retired bookseller, and he's always been interested in Latin, never had time. His wife passed away, and he was like looking for a project to keep his mind, occupied. And he got into our courses and like fell in love with Latin. And so now Latin has become his thing. He's like, he thinks it keeps his mind, agile. He's considering now starting to come on some of our travel programs and like meeting up with people in our synchronous online courses, reading ancient texts together and, building relationships. So, my vision for all of this is not just to, spread the gospel of Latin learning, but I hope to, create a community of people who are interested in these classical foundations of culture and, provide ways for them to come together, synchronously online, but also in person, at conferences. We run a conference every year in New York, at our programs in Europe, visiting these places. So, I think that what's most exciting about developing this new suite of prospects is the potential for the development of this community and a sort of revitalization, of humanistic activity among many people who might have day jobs. They're an accountant and they do their Latin at night, and when they go on vacation, they go to Rome and read Cicero for a week. That kind of thing I find really inspiring, and I think would be good for society.
I think that's so beautiful. Can you talk a little bit more about the trips that you facilitate too? Because that's such an interesting part of what you do.
Definitely. Yeah. So those are all, in, honoring the legacy of Reggie Foster, and sort of similar approach. So it's like going to places in the ancient world that are historically relevant and pairing those places with texts. So you would, for instance, last year we run one program in Paris, which is called Living Latin in Paris, which focused on the Middle Ages. Latin was, of course, also the language of the Middle Ages, and there were these two amazing medieval lovers in France called Eloise and Abelard, and they had this kind of star-crossed romance. He was her teacher; she was brilliant prodigy. Her father didn't want them to be involved. He ended up finding out. Abelard was eventually castrated and killed, and they have this incredible epistolary romance. When they both died, they were buried separately, and then eventually later in history, their bones were exhumed and buried together in the cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris. And so, in that edition of that program that year, we read the Latin love letters of Eloise and Abelard, which was just amazing, and we're in Paris. It's in the winter, so it's dark and just spooky and awesome feeling. And then we go to their grave and read excerpts, in Latin, standing on their grave. It's just, it helps you commune with history and with the other people who are interested in that stuff. And that's kind of an example of what we do in all our courses. We also speak Latin as a living language. It's a sort of hallmark of our pedagogy. It makes it a little bit more engaging and active. And so, all of our stuff is designed in a way where it's spoken Latin friendly, so that people can use Latin as an active living language if they want to, but it also prepares you to read literature.
That's amazing. So I feel like a lot of what we've talked about has already answered this question, but for the parent who's listening to this and is curious and is intrigued by everything that you've said and is interested in perhaps investing in some of your programs for their child, but is perhaps a bit uncertain about, like, is this the right fit for my kid? Is this, like, I know we've made a strong, or you've made a strong argument against just thinking about education from a utilitarian standpoint, but like, is this, you know, of all the things that I want my kid to be learning, like, is this the most useful use of their time or whatever? How would you maybe define if you were assessing what types of students tend to be a really good fit for your program, or like maybe how a parent can think about whether or not this would be a good fit for their kids? Would you have anything to say that might help parents think through if this is going to be the right program for their kid?
Yeah, I mean, again, like, I think these programs are for the humanities kids generally. Like learning Latin comes naturally to the student who's interested in literature and history and loves stories and words and stuff like that.
I would have been perfect for your program, just for the record. Yeah. I would have eaten it up.
Yeah. But, you know, also the real quantitative types love it, because it's a very, you know, these ancient languages are real. They're very complex. They're more complex than modern languages. You know, the average English verb has, I think, like 12 forms or something like that. The average Latin verb has 50, and the average Greek word has 125. You know, they're.
Wait, can you expand on that for a second? I don't even know how to conceive 125.
Yeah, well, I don't know those numbers are exactly right, but it's something like that. It's like an order of magnitude greater almost. Okay, the reason is,
how is that possible?
The reason is that first of all, it's an inflected language, right? So like English is an inflected language too, but very little. So we say I walk, you walk, he walks, right? So we change the ending to communicate that is a third person singular use of the verb, right? Latin does that for every verb and every noun in every case, right? So like, it's not just changing all the verbs all the way through like Spanish or French does, but it's also changing the nouns. So if a noun is an object, we have this in English too, like I am here, but you are talking to me. So like when I'm the direct object, I changes to me, but we only do that with the pronouns. Latin does that with every single word. So there's just like a lot more endings in these ancient languages. And that's also helpful because it helps you understand grammar. Like you get like subject versus object. You'll never confuse who and whom if you learn Latin, because you sort of just get used to that. But then there's also extra stuff which we don't have. So there's like the subjunctive mood in Latin and various forms that you like. It's just like, for instance, like the perfect passive is formed by two forms of the word that we don't use in English. And then Greek has even more stuff. Greek has extra categories of meaning that we don't have in English at all. So it has a different mood. So in English, we actually do have the subjunctive. Some people might not know that, but the reason that you say, you know, I give him directions in order that he find the store and not in order that he finds the store is because that find is subjunctive in English, but you don't really see it that much in the form. Whereas in Greek, the subjunctive has its own set of forms. There's another voice that we don't have in English at all called the optative, which has its own set of forms, another mood rather. But then there's also more voices. There's another number. So Greek has singular, plural, and dual. So when you talk about things in pairs of twos, there's a different ending for that. So it's extremely complex, and it really, like, every sort of thing about language that you can think of and many things that you can't think of are signified in this language. And that makes you understand the building blocks of languages like really well. So then when you like go to learn Spanish or French or even, you know, a non-Indo-European language like Chinese, you just get how language works at a very fundamental level.
That's so interesting. It's interesting to me that the old language is a more complicated one. Like, do you think that more modern languages have simplified out the things that are unnecessary? Or were we just like more brilliant linguists 2,500 years ago? Like, what's your take on this?
Yeah, good question. So this is more of a linguistics question. Like, do languages simplify? Yeah. I don't think so. I think all languages are like equally complex, but they're like complex in different ways, if that makes sense. So like, for instance, Greek is like morphologically complex. That means it has lots of forms, lots of weird different endings. English has a lot less, but English does other things that are like devastatingly complex. Like, for instance, what's the difference between the and the? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think anyone really knows, but like native speakers say the in some places and the in other places because it just like sounds right, And there are ways in which like all languages are challenging and hard in different ways, I think. And it also depends what your native language is and what you're familiar with. But for Western people, I'm gonna leave the Semitic and Asian languages out for a minute, but just for Western stuff, learning Latin and ancient Greek, just give you amazing building blocks for understanding all the other cultural stuff that's connected to that: language, culture, literature, poetry, history, and that goes, you can take it one step further back too if you're just curious, because Greek and Latin, there's a language that they both come from, which is called Proto-Indo-European, which doesn't even exist anymore, but we know about because we can see similarities. So starting to study those gives you glimpses of what's even behind that. So I wouldn't even say like it's only for humanities kids, because a lot of these things are like, does your kid love technical systems? Do they love how things work? Do they want to understand the root of things? And I think Greek and Latin are, classics in general. Is great for them too.
If people have found this interesting and they're curious to know more about what you're doing at Paideia, or if they are interested to know more about your work specifically, you've mentioned articles that you've written and stuff. I know that there's a bunch of content that you have in various places on the internet. Where would you send them next?
Best place is paideiainstitute.org, just the website of our organization. I publish most of my stuff through our blog, and all of our programs are there. So that's Paideia Institute.org. And that's the best place. And we would love to interact with, more of your audience and, get them going, learning Latin, and, open this whole world up to them.
Amazing. And I'll share links to everything that we talked about in the show notes too, so people will be able to click and find directly from listening to this everything that we've discussed. This has been so much fun. Thank you for indulging all of my convoluted questions about, like, I knew that we were going to go down rabbit holes that I didn't anticipate at the start of our call. I am delighted by what they turned out to be. This has been so much fun.
Same.
Thank you so much for taking the time for this.
Yeah, same here. I had a great time, and I really appreciate you, giving me the opportunity to come on here and talk about what we're doing. It's really awesome. So, and congratulations on, what you're built, and all the ways in which you're helping people, enrich their kids' education. It's an awesome contribution. So congratulations.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. I am very hopeful that this conversation inspires some families to go learn Latin, because I am all fired up after this conversation. This has been great.
Great.
Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, Jason.
All right. Thank you, Hannah.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.